At Siler Creek Logging Camp, deep in the Cascade foothills of Washington state, a stack of blackened, rotting logs sat forgotten at the edge of the clearing. Logs everyone agreed were worthless, soft enough to crumble between two fingers, headed straight for the burn pile by week's end. Except one man wouldn't let them burn. Walt Pierce was 61 years old, with sawdust ground permanently into the creases of his hands. Every morning he walked past that pile and gave the same order: leave them alone. No explanation, just 3 words, repeated like a ritual. The younger crew laughed about it behind his back. Dale Whitfield laughed about it to his face. "They're rotten, Walt," Dale said, kicking a chunk of crumbling bark loose with his boot. "They're worth less than the dirt under them." Walt didn't argue. He just kept circling that pile every single day, sometimes crouching beside one log for 10 or 15 minutes, running his fingers along the splits in the bark like he was reading something only he could see. Then, on a cold October morning, steam began rising from inside one of the logs. Steam that had no business being there. No one could explain why. If you've ever trusted a quiet feeling everyone else laughed at, hit subscribe and stick around. Give this video a like, and tell us where in the world you're watching from. Now let's find out what was really happening inside those rotten logs. Siler Creek had been a working timber site for 11 seasons, tucked against a ridge thick with Douglas fir and western hemlock. The crew cleared deadfall every fall before the snow came, and most of what they hauled out went straight to the chipper or the burn pile, anything too far gone for the mill. The pile at the edge of the clearing was about as far gone as wood could get. A dozen fir logs, soft with rot, their bark peeling away in damp gray sheets. Fungus bloomed along every seam. To Russ Calder, the foreman, they were a liability, a fire hazard sitting too close to the equipment shed. "Burn it Friday," Russ told the crew during morning briefing, not even glancing at Walt. Walt waited until the others had scattered before he spoke. "Give me till the end of the month." Russ studied him. 20-some years they'd worked together, and Walt had never once asked for a favor that didn't make sense later. Why? "Not sure yet," Walt admitted. "But I want to look first." It wasn't the answer Russ wanted, and it definitely wasn't the answer Dale wanted, since Dale had already volunteered to swing the axe come Friday. But Russ nodded, slow and reluctant, and walked off shaking his head. That was the moment the ridicule started in earnest. By lunch, half the crew had a joke ready. Tessa Bowen, the newest hire, didn't laugh along. She watched Walt instead, the way he'd stop mid-stride near the pile, tilt his head and listen, to logs that, as far as anyone could tell, weren't doing anything at all. Then she noticed something herself, a faint, sweet smell coming off the bark that didn't smell like rot at all. Walt had been noticing small things about that pile for almost 3 years, long before anyone official ever flagged it for removal. It started with the beetles, not the usual bark beetles that chewed through healthy timber, but a slower-moving, copper-colored variety he didn't recognize, clustering only on the most deeply decayed wood. He'd mentioned it once to a forestry extension officer, who shrugged and said decomposing wood always drew something or other. Then came the markings, faint, spiral grooves beneath the bark, almost too regular to be natural. Walt had seen plenty of insect galleries in dead wood. These didn't look like any of them. The smell came next, sweet and faintly mineral, strongest after rain. And one evening in early September, Walt swore he heard something, a low, intermittent clicking from inside one of the larger logs, like rain on a tin roof, except the sky had been clear for 2 days. He told no one about the sound. He wasn't sure he believed it himself. What he could not ignore was the moss. Dense, unusually vivid green moss had taken hold across 3 of the logs, in patches shaped almost like rings, and every other log nearby, equally rotten, equally damp, had nothing of the kind. Animals behaved strangely around the pile too. A pair of Townsend's chipmunks had built a den at its base and refused to relocate even after the crew cleared brush within 10 feet of it. A barred owl had taken to perching on the tallest log most evenings, silent, watching the ground. None of it added up to anything Walt could explain to Russ, let alone to Dale. But every observation stacked on the last, and Walt had learned a long time ago, first as a young logger, then as a man who'd buried a wife and outlived 2 knee surgeries, that patience usually told you more than questions did. So he kept watching, and he kept saying nothing. The end-of-month deadline came and went, and Walt asked for 2 more weeks. Russ gave him 1. Dale wasn't quiet about his frustration. "We've got a quota, Walt. We're not running a nature preserve." He said it loud enough for the whole crew to hear, and a few of the younger hands snickered. Then the weather turned. An early-season storm rolled down from the Cascades, dumping 6 inches of rain in 2 days and turning the clearing to mud. The equipment shed flooded an inch deep. Russ, soaked and furious, told Walt the pile needed to go before the ground froze. Wet, rotten wood that close to the shed was asking for trouble. Walt didn't sleep much that week. His daughter called from Spokane, worried he was overworking himself again, the way he had the winter after her mother passed. "Dad, it's logs," she said gently. "Let it go." He almost did. Then the chainsaw on the lead skidder seized up, a part failure nobody could explain, the third equipment issue that month, and the crew lost 2 full working days waiting on a replacement part from Yakima. Russ's mood soured further. Money was tight, the contract with the mill carried a penalty clause for missed deadlines, and the clock was ticking on more than just one pile of logs. Through all of it, Walt kept walking the pile, kept crouching beside the logs, kept saying nothing useful when anyone asked why. Even Tessa, who'd quietly started believing there was something there, began to wonder if Walt was simply tired, stubborn, chasing a feeling instead of a fact. Marcus Olin, one of the older hands who'd mostly stayed out of the mockery, finally asked him straight, "Walt, what exactly are you looking for?" Walt looked at the pile for a long moment. "I don't know yet," he said, "but something in there is alive, and it isn't supposed to be." The first real break came from Tessa, not Walt. While clearing brush near the pile, she found a fist-sized chunk of bark that had sloughed off in the storm. Underneath, the wood wasn't gray and crumbling like the rest. It was riddled with tunnels, smooth-walled and oddly uniform, packed with a fine black residue that looked almost like charcoal. Walt turned the piece over in his hands for a long time. "That's not insect work," he finally said. "Insects don't burn anything." It was Marcus who suggested calling someone, specifically a state wildlife biologist he'd worked with years back on a separate salvage logging site. Russ, by now too curious and too tired of arguing, allowed it. The biologist, a soft-spoken woman named Dr. Ann Sorrell, arrived within the week and spent an entire afternoon on her knees in the mud. What she found inside the first log floored everyone watching. A small, slick-skinned salamander, mottled brown and gold, tucked into a moisture pocket deep in the decayed heartwood. "Van Dyke's salamander," she said. "They need exactly this. Old, deeply rotted conifer wood, high moisture, low disturbance. We thought the nearest known population was almost 40 miles from here." That explained the chipmunks unwilling to leave. It explained the owl, drawn to easy prey. It didn't explain the charcoal-packed tunnels, or the steam Walt had seen weeks earlier, and Dr. Sorrell admitted she had no answer for either. The steam mystery cracked 2 days later, when a visiting dendrochronologist, a colleague Dr. Sorrell brought along almost as an afterthought, sawed a thin cross-section from the most damaged log to study its growth rings. Decomposing wood often releases trapped moisture as warm internal gases meet cold morning air, he explained. Nothing supernatural, just biology doing what biology does when nobody's watching closely enough. But the rings themselves told a different story. Counting outward from the center, the dendrochronologist found nearly 400 growth rings, each one scarred in a distinct repeating pattern. Narrow bands consistent with severe drought years, and dark charred lines marking old fire scars buried deep inside healthy growth. The tunnels weren't insect work at all. They were ancient fire scars, hollowed further by decades of decay, preserving a charcoal record nobody had any reason to expect survived this long, this intact. "This tree," he said quietly, "started growing sometime before this country had a name. Over the following weeks, what had looked like a pile of garbage became something closer to a sealed time capsule. The fire scars, cross-referenced against regional climate records, lined up with droughts and wildfires researchers had only ever pieced together from scattered, incomplete sources. The salamander population, once mapped, turned out to be larger and healthier than any nearby site on record. An entire hidden colony thriving in wood everyone had been ready to burn. Rotten wood isn't waste, Dr. Sorrell said simply, during her final visit. To half the forest, it's the most valuable real estate there is. It wasn't treasure, it wasn't a secret hidden by some long-dead trapper or miner. It was something quieter, and in its own way rarer, proof that the things we're fastest to call worthless are often doing work nobody bothered to notice. The State Forestry Office flagged the entire pile for protected status pending further study, and within a month, the salvage logging contract at Siler Creek was formally amended to set aside any similarly decayed deadfall for habitat assessment before disposal. Walt hadn't been chasing fame, or vindication, or even certainty. He'd just refused to mistake decay for emptiness. Dale was the first to apologize, awkwardly, over coffee one morning. "I figured you were just being stubborn," he admitted. "I was," Walt said. "Stubborn's not the same as wrong." Within weeks, the crew that had mocked Walt's daily ritual started doing something closer to imitating it. Tessa began logging her own observations in a notebook, bark patterns, insect activity, anything unusual, and Russ, despite himself, started consulting Walt before any deadfall pile got cleared. Marcus put it best, talking to a new hire who hadn't been there for any of it. "Out here, the wood that looks the most finished is usually the wood that's just getting started." Walt never gave speeches about it. He didn't need to. He kept walking the site every morning, same as always, eyes on the ground, hands in his pockets. Except now, when he stopped beside a rotten log and crouched down to look, the crew slowed down too, just to see what he'd find. Months later, long after Dr. Sorrell's team had relocated their study elsewhere, Walt still walked past that stretch of forest most mornings before the crew arrived. He never claimed to be smarter than anyone else on site. He'd simply been willing to wait, to let a question sit unanswered for years instead of forcing a conclusion just to feel finished with it. The forest had been telling its story the whole time, in steam and moss and the patient clicking of something small and alive. It just needed someone willing to listen long enough to hear it. If you've ever looked twice at something everyone else had already written off, tell us about it in the comments below. And if this story reminded you that patience sees what haste never will, share it with someone who needs that reminder today.